Howdy, y'all. One of the first things in my life I can actually remember was the election of Barack Obama. Now, I'm not just saying this to make 60% of my audience feel old. Rather, I want to put into context the unique political environment that myself and my peers have come up in. The Obama election brought with it this idea of a post-racial America. That we are a nation that had racism in the past, with slavery and Jim Crow and segregation. But we have moved past that, abolished slavery, outlawed Jim Crow, integrated. This narrative will, of course, concede that interpersonal racist actions may still occur, in rare instances, but that isn't something that lawmakers, the media, or the public at large should really focus on. America, as a nation, has moved past racism. After all, the nation elected Barack Obama. How could a black man hold the highest office in a nation that's supposedly racist? Regular viewers of the channel, or just life in general, will recognize that this narrative is bunk. Racism is very much still a factor impacting American life and politics today. Outwardly racist politicians are winning elections now. The current president was proudly and openly racist, literally to Obama, and he's in the White House now. Nonetheless, this post-racial idea of America remains prevalent, particularly amongst conservatives, who, as of 2025, per Pew Research Center, are more likely to believe there is significant societal discrimination against white people than black people. It's only by 1 percentage point, but that is a statistic that is way too hilarious to ignore. Also, for what it's worth, they're 7% more likely to say there's a lot of discrimination against white people. Besides the fact that racism did not end with Obama, there's one more problem with this narrative, and that's my initial framing of it as unique. There's never been another black president, of course, but this idea of racism in America no longer being a significant issue worthy of discussion or addressing is not a new one. It's been around for well over a century. What's most interesting is how often it's tied to the prominence and perceived success of individual black political figures. So today, we'll be looking at 3 of these figures, their rhetoric, and the rhetoric surrounding them, and examine how racism continued to affect both them personally, but also America as a whole. Content warning for discussion of racism and racist imagery. Obviously. Part 1. Barack Obama. In 2008, Black Americans made perhaps the most significant advance in their rights ever, when Barack Obama was elected to the nation's presidency, and the white supremacy that had been the rule of the land for centuries all melted away. Truly, this was the end of racism in America. At least, this is the belief one may have come away with following the election. It's difficult to understate just how much excitement there was about his election. That most significant advancement thing isn't just me making stuff up for the video. A Gallup poll from immediately after the 2008 election returned 71% of respondents calling it one of the most important advancements for Black people in America. In this jubilant environment, many publications were quick to declare racism over in the general sense, with America having finally achieved the dream Martin Luther King Jr. articulated all those years ago. One of the main appeals of this idea of a post-racial society was explained by Ta-Nehisi Coates in his book, We Were 8 Years in Power, where Coates identifies the way that every major Black civil rights achievement has been characterized within the story of American progress, writing, "For now, the country holds to the common theory that emancipation and civil rights were redemptive. This common theory holds the possibility of ultimate resolution, For if right-thinking individuals can dedicate themselves to finishing the work of ensuring freedom for all, then perhaps the ghosts of history can be escaped. Coates goes on to challenge the conception of inexorable forward progress on black civil rights. To many, Obama's election was a sign that America had escaped the nasty racism which characterized its past, that a clean break could be established between pre- and post-Obama America. How could a country where a majority of voters supported Barack Obama continue to be in any sense racist? This argument would become a common rejoinder to accusations of racism in the US, typically ignoring the fact that in both Obama wins, he fell well short of obtaining a majority of the white vote, with white voters preferring the Republican Party in literally every election since the Civil Rights era. Hey, it's real curious how that works out, ain't it? This narrative that the country had accepted and embraced a black president, shedding its horrid history in the process, encounters another significant roadblock in how omnipresent and severe the racism directed at Obama specifically was. The shit he was put through could fill a book. And it did. I read a few of them for this video. So here's a lightning round of some of the things that stood out to me. Okay, so first, I don't really want to show much of it, but the amount of horrendously racist memes and images circulated about Obama is truly staggering and cannot be ignored. This one of a fake Obama Bucks, showing him with fried chicken, Kool-Aid, and watermelon, was circulated among a few Republican groups. What makes it notable to me is that the creator of this image was a liberal Obama supporter making fun of Republicans. Which, yeah, you were right that they'd embrace racist imagery, but guessing that Republicans would embrace racist imagery is, 1, the political equivalent of guessing the sun will come up in the morning, and 2, not an excuse to be racist as well. Next up, in a move that still strikes me as one of the dumbest things to happen in US politics, Obama's election saw the emergence of the Tea Party as a major force, stoked by billionaire donations, because grassroots conservatism is always oxymoronic. The Tea Party was a movement within the Republican Party that believed in being more right-wing, more libertarian, and as openly racist as they could get away with, helping to bring the idea of Obama as being racist against white people into the political mainstream, and lambasting his Affordable Care Act as reparations. Finally, news stations, particularly Fox, dealt in a lot of racially charged narratives surrounding him. During just a 2-week stretch on the campaign trail, Fox and its anchors called Michelle his baby mama, called a fist bump a terrorist fist jab, and joked about his hypothetical assassination. These racist media narratives would not stop after the election, only ramping in intensity throughout his entire tenure and beyond. In his book, Dog Whistle Politics, Ian Haney Lopez describes how Fox has trafficked in racially tinged attacks on Obama, including the spurious campaign that he was educated in an Islamic madrasa, that he harbors a deep-seated hatred for white people, and is a racist, that his father was a wife-beating alcoholic who didn't bother to get a divorce before marrying the next woman and having a few more kids, and the ad nauseum insinuation that Obama is not a US citizen. That last bit gets us to the most prominent and obvious example of how racists responded to the Obama administration. It is impossibly difficult to accept the narrative that America cannot be racist due to its acceptance of a black president when a large swath of the country was tirelessly fighting to argue that he was not a real American. This birtherism movement charged that Obama was a Kenyan and/or Muslim, casting him as an alien other because as we know, Kenyans and Muslims can't be Americans. The Islamophobia was very prominent, with conservative voices frequently making a point to emphasize Obama's middle name, Hussein, in discussion of him, the unspoken purpose being to align his image with that of former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. These narratives continued even after Obama released his birth certificate. Of course, the point had never been a genuine belief that Obama's presidency was invalid due to his citizenship, but rather to play on xenophobic and Islamophobic beliefs within the American people to stoke opposition to Obama. As activist and historian Ibram X. Kendi puts it, these birtherist attacks were not started out of ignorance, so why would they go away out of knowledge? The success of this birtherist rhetoric is perhaps best observed through the success of one of its most notable supporters. Donald Trump has been active in sowing doubt as to Obama's citizenship since 2011, and following the 2012 release of his birth certificate, would pivot to calling it fake, and demanding the release of his college records and passport, and calling him the founder of the terrorist group ISIS. As bold-faced as the bullshit is, it had a serious effect. Trump did win the presidency in 2016 after all, and the birtherism movement undoubtedly played some part in this. Political scientist Philip Klinkner found that in the 2016 election cycle, "Is Barack Obama a Muslim?" was the single question that best predicted which candidate a white voter preferred, more so than even, "Are you a Republican?" There is certainly something to be said for how the nation, supposedly in its post-racial era, replaced Obama with a candidate as brazenly and openly racist as Donald Trump. Many have noted how periods of supposed civil rights advancement for any group can often lead to a period of political backlash, such as the current anti-trans backlash, framed as a response to the supposed glut of privileges enjoyed by transgender people in the mid-2010s, or the feminist backlash of the late 20th century, described in Susan Faludi's Backlash. Watch my right-wing women video, please. Or how every major incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan has arisen in response to a perceived threat posed by black people, whether that be emancipation, Red Scare, or civil rights. And while the KKK itself is not as prominent in 21st century America as it was in the 20th, the prominence of extreme right-wing hate groups is undeterred, most notably with the emergence of the alt-right, a predominantly internet-based white supremacist hate movement that rose to prominence in the Obama and Trump years. The white supremacist website Stormfront saw a 600% increase in traffic immediately after the election. The rhetoric pushed by alt-right sites and figures would be parroted in the manifestos of many mass shooters. And famously, the alt-right Unite the Right rally saw the movement being praised by President Trump, despite one of the protesters literally killing somebody, and the rest of these supposedly fine people shouting neo-Nazi slogans. And much like the Tea Party before them, the alt-right appears to have seen some success in their Unite the Right mission, with the Republican Party's seeming embrace of more extremist positions such as belief in a white genocide. In the face of such obvious racism, literally directed at Obama, from before his presidency to beyond, how can anyone square this belief that his election symbolized some ultimate triumph over anti-black racism in the US? On December 30th, 2008, Forbes published an op-ed by Dr. John McWhorter titled, "Racism in America is Over." McWhorter, a professional linguist, was far from alone in his assessment following the election. I could have picked from hundreds of op-eds hailing our post-racial epoch, but this article is a bit special. For starters, it's the least embarrassingly bad one I could find. McWhorter is, at the very least, a professional writer. More importantly, This article serves as a good case study for how the language on racism has evolved following the Obama election. McWhirter opens on the question, "Are we now in a post-racial America?" He clarifies that the discussion only really concerns Black people, or as he puts it, the people who are America's eternal shame, and concludes that, yes, America is past racism against Black people. McWhirter dodges the painfully dumb claim that racism magically ended because of Obama, instead opting for the more subtly dumb claim that Obama's election proves that racism is no longer a serious problem. He concedes that, sure, there will still be one-off racist instances, but claims even these evidence racial progress, writing, "It's not an accident, however, that increasingly, alleged cases of racism are tough calls, reflecting the complexity of human affairs, rather than the stark injustice of Jim Crow, or even redlining. A young Black man is shot dead by 3 police officers, and only one of them is white. A white radio host uses a jocular slur against Black women, used for decades in the exact same way by Black rappers, celebrated as bards." Yeah, he's one of those guys. Here, McWhirter makes the claim that, in the past, racism was obvious and easily understood and condemned. I wonder if that was the actual position at the time and not just looking back. But this idea that present racism is too complex is important to him. McWhirter writes that the idea that a country all about racism would elect a Black man is too abstract for him to follow, and that most Americans will feel similarly. McWhirter adopts the position of the arbiter of public discourse, declaring that since racism is so abstract and insignificant now, according to him, it no longer holds a position worthy of national attention. McWhirter instead believes we should focus on the supposed actual issues facing Black America, pointing specifically to Black-on-Black homicides. Now, this is ordinarily where I'd take a few minutes to explain the link between poverty and violent crime, and how much of American history and institutions, such as the redlining McWhirter himself pointed out, have functioned to segregate Black Americans and keep them in severe poverty. I'd also probably throw in something about how America's lax gun control laws serve to turn many interactions from merely aggressive to fatal. But you see, McWhirter has already considered this. One might fashion an involved, subtle argument as to how, when a 15-year-old in Brooklyn shoots another one in the face, it is traceable to racism, likely societal or institutional. However, there are problems with this line of reasoning. First, arguments like these are too arcane to unite the nation behind some kind of relief effort. People being hosed to the ground in Birmingham was one thing, but what would the anti-racist plan be now? How do you eliminate racism of the kind that sparked a chain reaction that led to that 15-year-old having and using that gun? Once again, we see McWhirter lionizing the civil rights movement as the crowning example of anti-racist activism which addresses an actual problem. But his primary concern with modern anti-racism doesn't seem to be whether or not the advocates are correct. He largely sidesteps any actual discussion of the veracity of systemic racism as an issue, simply stating that it's too confusing to build policy out of. But after he's sidestepped the actual argument, he goes on to make the most ludicrous claim of the article. Second, think about it. Even if you could wave a magic wand and eliminate this racism today, the murders we are dealing with would continue. In the same way, how is the AIDS crisis in Black America due to racism? i.e., in a way such that we could eliminate that racism and see AIDS disappear. Millions of Black school children never learn to read well because teachers' unions have no interest in the phonics-based, drill-focused program called Project Follow Through that has been proven since the 60s to teach poor kids to read well. The role of racism in this is decidedly obscure. So, after just refusing to engage with the discussion of systemic racism, McWhorter proudly claims that even if you could get rid of systemic racism, it wouldn't change anything. What is he basing this on? I don't know. Vibes? Conveniently, the actual solutions to the problems facing Black America happen to be just whatever pet policy he already supports. But like, Mr. McWhorter, because I know you're watching this, even if every school in the country adopted your beloved phonics drills, that would not change the fundamental issue that predominantly Black schools have been historically and presently underfunded, largely a product of redlining, a form of systemic racism you appear to actually acknowledge. The beautiful and perfect phonics drills aren't going to work with a 40-to-1 student-teacher ratio and practically no money for supplies. This is largely representative of how conservatives have discussed systemic racism in the last few decades. It's obvious on the face of it that Black Americans, as a group, have it worse than white Americans, with lower average wealth, higher incarceration rates, and so on. And anyone with a modicum of intellectual integrity would be able to point to the significance of systemic racism in these varying outcomes. But to the conservative, the champion of the status quo, it's imperative that the problem not be racism, but rather something else, anything else. That's why McWhorter points to phonics drills in 2008, and that's why in 2025, Charlie Kirk goes to a college campus and asks whether systemic racism or fatherless homes are a bigger issue. The right has largely glommed onto this idea that systemic racism is too confusing. Kirk proudly questions what law is systemically racist of the student he's arguing with, relying on them not being able to articulate a proper response in the 5 unprepared seconds he allows them to speak before cutting them off. Just like with McWhorter, the narrative relies on not actually considering what systemic racism is, merely dismissing it out of hand. And with this Kirk example, we can see one of the more insidious elements of this rhetoric, imposing the narrative that systemic racism doesn't exist, and the most significant factor in achievement gaps between Black and white Americans is the absence of Black fathers. The audience is implicitly driven towards the conclusion that this fatherless home crisis must be the result of some innate issue with Black men. An analysis which considered the impact of racist policies would point out how, say, the disproportionate incarceration of Black men contributes to this, and point out the factors leading to that disproportionate incarceration rate. But the conservative analysis does not see systemic racism as worth consideration. Even if it is acknowledged that there's a racially disproportionate incarceration rate, the audience is left to conclude that it must be a result of some higher criminality inherent to Black men. And while I'm sure McWhorter will say in the comment section, because he is watching this, that it's ludicrous to suggest his arguments would lead readers to conclude that Black people are inherently more prone to spreading AIDS or shooting each other in the face, I'd argue that when your entire position is based on being willfully ignorant enough to just dismiss systemic racism out of hand, you can't be surprised when you cultivate an audience actually ignorant enough to jump to the racist conclusions you're leading them towards. I was honestly shocked at just how perfectly McWhorter typifies this rhetoric. It became less shocking when I found out he is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank which has been shaping how Americans talk about racism for decades now. most recently being one of the main drivers of furor over critical race theory. This massive uproar trying to shut down the mere discussion of systemic racism is keeping in line with the goals McWhorter outlines in the final paragraphs of his article. That racism is no longer a topic worthy of discussion, so would y'all please just shut up about it so we can more easily pretend it doesn't exist? He does touch on one important thing for analyzing racism in the Obama years, though. In talking about how we shouldn't really care about Fox News being racist against him, McWhorter writes, "Obama himself has urged us to think larger than this." This points to our final factor for the popularity of post-racial rhetoric in the wake of the Obama election, and that is Obama's own approach to race as candidate and president. A critical part of Obama's legacy is how much he dodged discussion of race. As Haney Lopez writes, after his Philadelphia speech in 2008, and until his heartfelt remarks on the verdict in the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2013, Obama effectively stopped speaking about race to the general public. By one account, talking about race less than any Democratic president since 1961. For Obama, to be post-racial meant to eschew any mention of race. And if this meant largely abandoning efforts to specifically promote racial justice, then so be it. And this wasn't just Obama's personal approach. His administration did its best to quiet other Democrats on race matters. Why did he do this? Well, it definitely wasn't because he didn't consider racism a problem. In the previously noted Philadelphia speech, Obama says that he doesn't consider racism endemic to America. But he's not blind. He's aware that racism has been a huge problem, which continues to shape lives today. But he is also not blind to who he is, what he represents. Barack Obama is a black man, and in America, that is often seen as a first strike. He was aware that he would be subject to more vitriol on the campaign trail, more double standards and bullshit attacks than a white candidate in the same position. In order to overcome this, he needed to put some distance between himself and the conservative conception of angry black people agitating for special privileges that had become enshrined in the late 20th century. More on that in part 2. As Haney Lopez observed, this saw Obama proactively adopting a lot of positions that de-emphasized race and racism. He notes that Obama adopted the respectability politics position of lecturing black people to take responsibility, while simultaneously playing the colorblind card on issues of racial injustice, such as his public statements on the response to Hurricane Katrina, where he said, "The incompetence was colorblind." Furthermore, Haney Lopez notes how when Obama took a non-colorblind approach, it was often to validate white racial anxieties, writing of how, when discussing white animosity towards school busing and affirmative action programs aimed at combating the ongoing effects of racist policy, Obama validated this animosity, saying their positions were grounded in legitimate concerns, and it would be wrong to call them misguided or even racist. Haney Lopez notes that because Obama was cognizant of how he would be perceived if he ran for president on a platform of dismantling systemic racism or being super progressive, he was driven to more conservative rhetoric simply to have electoral viability. We can see this in the Philadelphia speech. While discussing how systemic racism continues to hurt African Americans, Obama points to the erosion of black families, identifying contributing factors such as lack of economic opportunities, but also calling it a problem that welfare policies for many years have worsened, in a move that reads more like Ronald Reagan than hope and change. Now, I do want to note that I'm not trying to say Barack Obama doesn't care about black people. That's not my place to say, honestly. And in his later and post-presidency career, he has spoken out more on racism. But it's clear that de-emphasizing race was a major political strategy for him. There was a problem with this approach, though. No matter how much he de-emphasized race, he was still black. As Coates puts it, the irony of Barack Obama is this: he has become the most successful black politician in American history by avoiding the radioactive racial issues of yesteryear, by being clean, as Joe Biden once labeled him. And yet, his indelible blackness irradiates everything he touches. There was never going to be a world where Obama didn't face a remarkably obstinate opposition, where new political factions weren't set up by billionaires to limit his impact, where his citizenship wasn't turned into a debate, where his Supreme Court picks weren't blocked in an unprecedentedly obstructionist move. When he pointedly went out of his way to avoid discussing race, he was accused of inserting race into the discussion, a standard that only non-white people are held to. When he criticized police for arresting Henry Louis Gates for trying to get into his own house, Obama was denounced so severely that he literally had to invite Gates and the cop to the White House for drinks. And this is the man that is held as the beacon of an America whose racism problems are behind it. It is a farce. It is a lie. And it is not the first time this has happened. Part 2. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1965, Black Americans made perhaps the most significant advance in their rights ever, when the Voting Rights Act, championed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was signed into law, following the Civil Rights Act the prior year, and the white supremacy that had been the rule of the land for centuries all melted away. Truly, this was the end of racism in America. At least, this is the belief many in the following decades would come away with. As discussed in the previous section, one of the main focuses of those who seek to deny the prevalence of racism as a major factor in modern American life is the lack of explicitly racist laws. These two acts outlawed racial discrimination in public life and in voting. When racism is technically illegal, how can racism exist? Now, there's the obvious answer, that making racism technically illegal doesn't magically erase the disadvantages accrued over generations of racial discrimination, enslavement, and wealth extraction. Nor does it instantly flip a switch, turning racists into allies, and negating that the negative racial attitudes held by white Americans could negatively impact Black Americans in areas such as housing and employment, where despite employment discrimination being prohibited by the Civil Rights Act, studies have found that, to this day, employers are less likely to reach out to candidates with Black-sounding names. This is the product of pervasive cultural racism, which associates Blackness with laziness and unproductivity. A particularly insulting association, giving Black labor's role in America like existing in the first place. This type of cultural racism is not something that can be easily rectified with policy. This is kind of the whole reason that critical race theory as a school of thought and DEI as a practice exist. But of course, both of these were main targets by the conservative right for their supposed reverse racism. More on that later. Then there's the answer that's obvious if you've studied your history books, which is that the Civil and Voting Rights Acts only represented the end of explicitly racist policy, leaving the door open to implicitly racist policy that continues to this day. In the 1960s, the US saw a major political realignment between its two largest parties. Democrats had hitherto been the party of the South, dominating the region in practically every election since the Civil War. And while it is a consistent goal of mine to stress that racism is a nationwide issue, the Midwest was the biggest region for the KKK in the 1920s after all, it's also true that white supremacist rhetoric does have a lot of pull in the part of the country that seceded to preserve slavery and is still proud of that fact. Thus, in 1964, it was a big deal when Republicans ran Barry Goldwater. Not because he won, he lost by 434 points. But he did something no Republican had prior. He won the Deep South. This was in large part because of how much his campaign dealt in racism. Such as my favorite example, when he created a fake women's group to make a propaganda film that essentially said, America used to be good, but now it's bad, and we won't say why it's bad, but we will play these videos of civil rights protesters and let you make the connection. In light of these results, the Republican Party would adopt the Southern strategy. That is to say, they would appeal to racist sentiments and promote racist policy. But they would do so in a manner that was not explicitly race-based. This is best explained in a 1981 interview with Republican strategist Lee Atwater, to the point that literally every single book I've ever read on the topic features this quote. You start out in 1954 by saying by 1968, you can't say that hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. Saying, we want to cut this, is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than This Southern strategy would prove wildly successful. Republicans controlled the White House for almost the entire time from 1968 to 1992, largely buoyed by Southern strategy rhetoric. The success of this rhetoric can be seen in mass incarceration and the war on drugs. From 1968, when Nixon was first elected, to 2008, when Obama was, the US prison population increased by roughly 8 times. But this was not a generalized increase. Black Americans were incarcerated at far higher rates than their white counterparts. In 2008, the incarceration rate for white men was 1 in 106, while the incarceration rate for black men was 1 in 15. This is not some quirk of the system, but rather mass incarceration functioning precisely as intended. Ronald Reagan, a major driver of mass incarceration, actually drew focus away from white-collar crimes, a move that seems strange if the point of being tough on crime is actually addressing crime, but makes sense if the point of being tough on crime is arresting black people en masse. The biggest driver of this mass incarceration was the war on drugs, a policy introduced by Nixon and pushed into overdrive by Reagan. This is a great example of how these Southern strategy pushes are crafted around the racist aim. At the time of the war on drugs unveiling, 2% of Americans thought that drugs were a serious issue, but they were able to make it into an issue by tying drug use to blackness. As Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, said in a 1994 interview, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. The war on drugs served to incarcerate Black Americans at wildly disproportionate rates, but also contributed heavily to racist perceptions. Differences in mandatory minimum sentencing, level of policing, and racial bias in policing led to situations where, despite Americans doing drugs at roughly similar rates across racial groups, Black Americans were accounting for almost all drug arrests. This led to increased associations with Black people and drug use, leading to more policing of Black communities, leading to more arrests. I don't mean to imply that racially coded politics is the sole dominion of Republicans either. The one Democrat to win the South after the Civil Rights Act was Jimmy Carter, who, on the campaign trail, delivered coded opposition to desegregation efforts. And the Democrat to break the Republicans' stronghold on the White House was Bill Clinton, who, while often lauded for his outreach to Black voters by playing the saxophone, was a champion of the tough-on-crime rhetoric pioneered by Nixon and Reagan, attending the execution of a mentally ill Black man to show how tough on crime he was, and passing the 1994 crime bill, which further expanded mass incarceration. The most powerful element of the Southern strategy is how it has managed to turn policies crafted with the express intention of hurting Black people into necessary positions that politicians across the aisle must hold. Attacking one's opponent for not being tough on crime remains a staple. Democrats continue to have to shy away from welfare programs, as seen with Obama, because Reagan's idea of Black welfare queens has stuck in the American consciousness. Modern rhetoric on drug crime continues to focus on locking people up for it, and continues to deal in racially coded perceptions of drug criminals, at least if the cries of illegal Mexicans bringing fentanyl into our country are anything to go off of. And this isn't even to mention the attacks on Black voting rights. I have 3 videos on this already, so if you want a fuller discussion, there you go. But the thing to note is that while the Voting Rights Act theoretically bans racial discrimination in voting, it's not the case in practice. As a product of mass incarceration and subsequently felon disenfranchisement, a staggering number of African Americans have been permanently stripped of their voting rights, to an extent that, if they had not been, George Bush would not have been president. Additionally, Republican state governments looked at racial population maps to gerrymander districts which specifically carved up Black population centers, preventing them from meaningfully affecting elections. When this practice was banned, because fucking obviously, they just switched to economic maps, and because of America's staggering racial wealth gap, achieved the same result. And voter ID laws have been constructed around the country aiming to prevent a non-existent problem of election fraud, but actually just disproportionately preventing African Americans from voting, with many of the laws choosing what types of IDs to accept or not accept based on whether Black people are more likely to own them. Oh, and also, the Supreme Court just overturns the ability to meaningfully enforce the Voting Rights Act. So, there's that. And the fun thing about these Southern strategy type policies is that they do empower supporters with this great deal of deniability that the obviously racist policies are in fact racist. Every time I've made a video about how voter ID laws are clearly racist if you look into them, I've gotten comment after comment about how they're not racist. And it's actually me being racist and thinking African Americans can't manage to get an ID. that I'm making everything about race and only looking at people as black victims or white oppressors, not looking within, to the content of their character. That brings us to something that I'm sure you've noticed by now. This section of the video is called Martin Luther King Jr., and yet I haven't actually mentioned him once since the introduction. Why is that? When dealing with MLK, you get the perception that he's not actually a person, rather just an idea. And I do mean an idea, as in one singular idea. A large portion of America seems to only concern themselves with a single speech of King's. Not even that. A single sentence of the speech. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Always fun to play the "can you name a single other quote by him" game. But this idea of content of character versus color of skin has become widely adopted in attacks on anti-racist programs and rhetoric. We are told that MLK was a champion of colorblindness. Not in the sense that, you shouldn't be racist, but in the sense that you just shouldn't really acknowledge race at all for any reason. It's a weird thing to pull from this speech, considering King says black and Negro a combined 19 times in it. Shockingly, the black civil rights leader wasn't blind to the fact of racism. But that's the thing though. King wasn't the originator of this colorblind ideal. The concept of colorblindness as a political tool largely stems from racists attempting to avoid desegregation. In my video, Segregation Nation, watch it, it's good, I detailed how opponents of school desegregation programs, such as busing, have often argued that these programs represent an overreach of the government, favoring a colorblind solution where you don't specifically desegregate, but rather just allow for integration in theory. The problem with this is that you're not actually doing anything. Segregation was not some minor thing, but a dedicated system which aimed to segregate in every area of life. Programs like redlining and slum clearance existed to force Black Americans out of areas where white Americans lived. Most people wind up going to the schools nearest to them. And when you have neighborhoods that continue to be largely segregated, you get segregated schools, even in a post-Brown v. Board world. This is actually the great failing of Brown v. Board as a decision. It outlaws segregation, but does nothing to actually mandate integration. This was seen in a 1974 case where the Supreme Court ruled Brown v. Board doesn't cover any busing plan that crosses district lines. The segregated districts. The refusal to actually desegregate keeps American schools largely segregated to this day. And yet, simply because segregation is technically illegal, while remaining a horrifically common practice, we are said to be living in MLK's dream, fully actualized and arrived. Today, the Trump administration axes what desegregation orders still exist, seemingly no longer necessary because of how long it's been. Even though, historically, when desegregation programs are ended on the basis of no longer being necessary, rapid resegregation ensues. This logic gets applied to everything, from affirmative action in college admissions, which people are literally still bitching about, even though the Supreme Court axed it in 2023, to affirmative action in general, which people are literally still bitching about because they're just kinda stupid. Anything which suggests racial inequality is a problem worth addressing is hit with the allegation that it's some sick perversion of MLK's supposed colorblind ideals. To quote Clay Kane in his book The Grift, today's GOP narrative says, let's skip from the Jim Crow era to a non-existent colorblind era, without taking stock of or responsibility for injustices that still occur and can't be explained by anything else but racism. This is, as we're supposed to believe, all in service of MLK's dream. But have y'all read the speech? Beyond the one line. I have. They had it posted up by the cafeteria in my high school, and I'd read it sometimes while skipping lunch, which was basically every day because who eats lunch at 11 a.m.? Aside, what I'm getting at is that the rest of the speech makes clear that King doesn't think the solution is just GOP-style colorblindness. One of the main focuses of the speech is the racial wealth gap. 100 years later, the Negro still lives on a lonely island of poverty, in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. King was not some blind idealist, purely pushing for theoretical equality, but unconcerned with economic and material reality. Those who aim to cast him as such do so because, fundamentally, they don't like what he actually believed. He was wildly unpopular until his death allowed for a sort of mental papering over of his actual beliefs. It says something that the nation's favorite black icon is the one that's too dead to correct the public perception of him. I would highly recommend watching The Whitewashing of Martin Luther King by Some More News for a deeper dive into what King actually believed and said, because it turns out the man whose writing and speeches fill literal bookshelves is more than a single quote. This pookification of MLK into an unproblematic figure who loves the systems of power as long as they're nominally not racist sucks for a lot of reasons. It defames a man who was and still would be a political radical. And this outsized focus on him alone weakens the perception of the movement as a whole. The civil rights movement was not MLK and friends. It was a multi-generational, multiracial, multi-gendered movement, formed of various groups, some of whom even believed different things. One of my favorite books on the civil rights movement is Jean Theoharis's A More Beautiful and Terrible History. It does a lot towards challenging this myopic view of the movement as just fighting segregation in name only. Theoharis points out how, for example, one of the goals of the Montgomery bus boycott was to secure jobs for black bus drivers. But these economic goals of the movement are largely ignored. She also dedicated 2 chapters to demonstrating the movement was not the work of just men, pointing out the massive coalition of women and student movements. And on the rare occasions non-MLK activists are brought up, they too are reduced to powerless caricatures. As Theoharis writes, Rosa Parks' vision has been relegated to a bus seat, narrowing what she fought for her entire life and how she defined her bus stand. Indeed, the movement itself has been constricted and diluted, framed narrowly around bus seats and lunch counters, rather than the equity, access, and justice these activists demanded. Tellingly, Parks and her comrades typically use the term desegregation rather than integration to signify that their struggle was not a matter of having a bus seat or a school desk next to a white person, but of dismantling the apparatus of inequality. And because of the national acceptance that the civil rights movement, as it has been warped and congealed in the American consciousness, was both completely successful and the gold standard for how civil rights activists should behave, an enduring part of MLK's legacy among conservatives and liberals alike has been in criticizing modern civil rights pushes. I'm sure we all remember the critical race theory panic about how much it violated King's dream, despite being a logical extension of the rhetoric the man himself championed. or the lambasting of Black Lives Matter protesters for their supposedly violent tactics, despite the violence typically being a response to police brutalization. One could almost say the protesters were met with a chorus of, "I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action." Hey, that's a cool quote, and wouldn't you know it, I just won the Name Another MLK Quote game. In the 1950s and 60s, America faced a reckoning with our racism. And after declaring racism technically illegal, we decided our job was done. The activists, of course, were too busy being dead, being impoverished, being imprisoned, or just being ignored to effect much actual change after their technical victory. With the great mandate laid before us, we said, good enough. And, why don't we pass a bunch of racist laws while we're at it? Today, Martin Luther King Jr., not the man, but the caricature, is held up as the beacon of an America whose racism problems are behind it, and as the symbol for why we need not hope, for why we need not fight, for the very things he fought for. It is a farce. It is a lie. And it is still not the first time this has happened. Part 3. Booker T. Washington. In 1895, Black Americans made perhaps the most significant advance in their rights ever, when Booker T. Washington delivered the Atlanta Exposition Address, and the white supremacy that had been the rule of the land for centuries all melted away. Truly, this was the end of racism in America. At least, this is the belief that would dominate the public's approach to Black civil rights in the coming decades. Now, I recognize that compared to MLK, the single most well-known anti-racist figure, and Obama, who was literally president, Booker T. Washington might not be as familiar of a figure. Fortunately for us, he wrote an autobiography. Washington has one of the most autobiography-worthy stories out there, even if the actual book kinda sucks. The title, Up From Slavery, kinda says it all. Washington, born into slavery in 1856, would, following emancipation, put himself through school through a combination of hard work and financial support from peers and mentors, eventually becoming the head of the Tuskegee Institute, now known as Tuskegee University. In this position, Washington would grow the prominence of the school, offering vocational training to Black students. Additionally, he would become a noted public figure, even receiving an honorary degree from Harvard. All of this appears to have given Washington the perspective of a lot of people that achieve success, that the way they did it is the right way, and purely a product of their own merit. Washington was a big proponent in the belief of American meritocracy, triumphing over systemic racism, writing, "The individual who can do something that the world wants done will, in the end, make his way, regardless of his race." Now, let's think. What would the successful principal of a vocational school consider the best route for African Americans to achieve success? In 1895, Washington was invited to deliver a speech at the Atlanta Exposition, a massive international event. In being there, Washington was essentially serving as the voice on African American issues, remarking in his book how this was the first time a Black man and Southern whites were speaking on the same platform on a big national occasion. And with the eyes and ears of the nation in rapt attention, Booker T. Washington took aim at Black America for trying to obtain political rights. Washington spoke on how ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life, we began at the top instead of at the bottom. That a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. It is at the bottom of life that we must begin, and not at the top. Nor should we permit our grievances to overshadow our opportunities. Now, a very generous person might call Washington's perspective practically minded. A less generous person might call it beyond insulting. I quite like Clay Cane's assertion. To think that black people somehow began at the top after the Civil War is a noxious narrative. Towards the end of the speech, Washington detailed the rest of his perspective on black progress. The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly, and that progress, in the enjoyment of all the privileges that will come to us, must be the result of severe and constant struggle, rather than of artificial forcing. No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. It is important and right that all the privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. Washington's approach appears to be a sort of trickle-down civil rights, where nothing is done to enshrine rights in the law, and the meritocratic might of the free market will eventually render everyone of all races equal, as long as they work hard and don't get into politics or ask for rights or anything like that. Washington is a favorite amongst conservatives, and it's not hard to see why. Now, the problem with ignoring political rights and just trying to get that bag is that it's stupid and doesn't work. For starters, immediately post-slavery, most African Americans had fuck all in terms of assets. While their labor had been used to generate wealth for their enslavers, they had nothing. Well, not nothing. In Washington's eyes, they had the industrial education offered to them by their time spent enslaved. Writing, "When freedom came, the slaves were almost as well fitted to begin life anew as the master, except in the matter of book learning and ownership of property. The slave owner and his sons had mastered no special industry. On the other hand, the slaves, in many instances, had mastered some handicraft." This is the second dumbest line in the book, because as it turns out, having all the actual assets was really important. It didn't really wind up mattering that plantation owners weren't great farmers themselves, when the lack of economic opportunities for newly emancipated African Americans meant most of them would continue to labor under the heavily exploitative sharecropping system. It must also be noted that racist whites instituted policies which further worsened their economic station. The widespread adoption of black codes absolutely ballooned the prison population in the South. And because the only way to reliably avoid getting imprisoned under these codes was to be employed by a white man, black people were further driven into sharecropping. I know we've talked about mass incarceration in all of these sections, and that's because this system of mass incarceration arose pretty much directly in response to emancipation. The 13th Amendment's exception, allowing involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime, drove a movement to imprison newly emancipated Black Americans and revert them to a status of legal slavery within the American justice system. It is one of America's greatest failings, and because it is America, it is a problem that still exists today. So it's clear that a lack of political protections inhibited the ability of African Americans to gain wealth. But this political inequality also resulted in their intentional exclusion from perhaps the most important wealth-building program in US history. One of the greatest factors in the development of the US middle class was New Deal housing programs, which allowed many families to obtain mortgages on houses through government loans, but famously carved out or redlined areas with notable African American populations as risky for lending, both furthering racial segregation and the racial wealth gap. Because in a system where there isn't political equality, obviously there isn't going to be economic equality, no matter how hard you grind. You can't even say, "Oh, Alex, how bad of you. You sit here with the benefit of hindsight, judging poor Booker T." Because Washington was constantly blasted by his contemporaries, most famously by the incredible historian and sociologist W.e.b. Du Bois, who in his 1903 collection of essays, The Souls of Black Folk, included a far more brutal takedown of Washington than I could get away with writing. He describes Washington's position as one of giving up three things: political power, insistence on civil rights, and higher education. And then notes how in the time in which Washington's approach was dominant, America saw 1. The disenfranchisement of the Negro, 2. The legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro, 3. The steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for the higher training of the Negro. Du Bois then goes on to describe what he sees as the triple paradox of Washington's career. Firstly, that he wants to bring up the race through economic means, but ignores the impossibility of competing in the market without being able to defend their rights. Secondly, that he aims to present a less agitated, cleaner, respectable image of Black America, because respectability politics are famously good and work, but at the same time counsels a silent submission to civic inferiority, such as is bound to sap the manhood of any race in the long run. I was kicking my feet when I read this, because Du Bois here is hitting on the idea that living in a position of inferiority will inevitably lead to internalizing that image of the self as inferior. The same idea that would later be seen in the doll tests, wherein Black children living under segregation were asked whether they preferred a white or a Black doll, and they overwhelmingly preferred the white ones, because they had internalized the white supremacy that surrounded them. I suppose this may have been a known sociological concept at the time, but I still thought it was a cool connection. And thirdly, Washington's cherished industrial education schools could not function without traditional higher learning institutions for Black students to provide teachers and training. Of course, while Du Bois's critique is very thorough, there's also something to be said for fellow sociologist Ida B. Wells's more direct assertion that Washington's gospel of work was merely slavery in a new dress. Of course, at the time, it didn't much matter that Washington's peers weren't fans of his. They weren't receiving nearly the national attention he was. They weren't being invited to speak at the Atlanta Exposition. They weren't advising 3 presidents. They weren't receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars from wealthy whites. Much how MLK has become, for many, the single figure of the civil rights movement, Washington was, as far as white America was concerned, the single figure of post-Reconstruction Black political thought. This wasn't because he was more correct than his peers. It was because he was more palatable to white supremacy. I'm gonna be really mean to Washington here, so let's take a quick second to say some nice things about him. First off, for as limp as most of his public rhetoric was, he did funnel money into civil rights causes in private, and spoke out on stuff like lynching, though he was criticized by Ida B. Wells for downplaying the role of racism in lynching. Second, all-timer name: Booker Taliaferro Washington? Cool. Alright, so the most obvious appeal of Washington to the white South was his near constant unwillingness to extend any condemnation to white people. He wrote of his father, a white man who raped his mother, as another unfortunate victim of the institution which the nation unhappily had engrafted upon it at the time. A truly fascinating framing of things. He said that enslaved people during the Civil War, or at least most of those who were treated with anything like decency, didn't hold bitterness towards their Confederate enslavers, who were fighting a war to keep them in bondage. He claimed that black politicians during Reconstruction were largely unqualified for their offices, and celebrated that black people seemed to be warming up to voting for white politicians. He proudly noted how he had never received a personal insult from a white Southerner. In his speeches, he didn't condemn the South, which delighted Southern audiences. He didn't condemn white people. Hell, he implored people to not even condemn the rich. His rhetoric was so palatable because it placed almost all the blame on black people. Du Bois noted how Washington became the representative of his race in the public eye, not because of his overwhelming support within the community, but because a racist South, and an also racist North, coming off the strife of the Civil War, weren't interested in the race problem that comes with actual civil rights policy. So having a prominent black man tell them it's just that black people aren't working hard enough, and thank them for the opportunity to say so, was a godsend. Now, to be kind to Washington, this refusal to be critical of white America was likely in part a survival strategy. He wasn't dumb, and would certainly have been aware of the danger of someone of his stature saying the wrong thing. Of course, this deference on racism was also important to securing donations for his school, with Ida B. Wells noting that Washington was telling chicken-stealing stories on his own people in order to amuse his audiences and get money for Tuskegee. So we have a charitable and less charitable reason to suggest Washington didn't completely buy into his own narrative. But I am inclined to accept that most of what he said in his life were his true beliefs. Partly because in discussing the Atlanta Compromise speech, he wrote, "I was determined to say nothing that I did not feel from the bottom of my heart to be true and right." But mostly because his ideology requires such naive optimism to believe. I quite like Michael Harriot's rejoinder to Washington's respectability politics. In Black as Fuck History, he writes, "I can't think of a single instance where liberty has been achieved through gradual means. Nor can I point to a single example of white people saying, 'You know what? I think I'm gonna stop oppressing you.'" Not only did Washington severely overestimate the power of a respectability politics approach, he severely underestimated the prominence of racism in America. The dumbest and saddest sentence in Up From Slavery is when Washington addresses the Ku Klux Klan, writing, "Today, there are no such organizations in the South, and the fact that such ever existed is almost forgotten by both races. There are few places in the South now where public sentiment would permit such organizations to exist." Shortly after Washington's death, the revived KKK would count its membership at around 4 million. The respectability politics approach didn't even work for Washington's personal life. For all the talk in Up From Slavery about not experiencing personal insults, after its publication, Washington would narrowly escape an assassination attempt by a group of white men. And in a truly heartbreaking story, Washington was assaulted by a white man who feared he intended to assault his wife. Washington then delivered a public apology to the man who assaulted him, which I do think was a matter of survival. But just like his private donations to civil rights causes, while these events suggest a deeper, more complex Washington, they didn't change the surface level narrative that he spread across the nation. Washington's rhetoric remained fairly steadfast through the end of his life. Did Booker T. Washington cause the post-Reconstruction backslide on civil rights? the absolute shelving of race issues in public discourse. No, at least not alone. The national abandonment of Black civil rights in the post-Reconstruction era was just that, a national project. When racist Southerners wished to enshrine white supremacy into law once again, and racist Northerners were willing to compromise on civil rights in order to maintain national unity, because nobody wanted another civil war. Into this environment emerges Washington, who, while in theory pushing a civil rights agenda, is doing so in a way that maintains the temporary inferiority of the race, and removes any actual legislation talks from public discourses, making the race problem more of a problem of Black people than a problem of America. And Washington's position as one of the most noted Black Americans, hell, with his widespread adoption by white America, the most noted, was a boon for those who'd wished to maintain white supremacy. To quote Clay Kane, if an allegedly distinguished Black man, like Booker T. Washington, was arguing that Black men should submit to white political rule, then saying so wasn't racist. If Booker T. Washington insisted that Black people should know their place and have zero political power, white supremacists seeking to preserve that powerlessness in law could take cover behind Washington's Blackness. Exactly 8 months after Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech, Plessy v. Ferguson solidified Jim Crow and the lie of separate but equal. In the post-Reconstruction period, America avoided a reckoning with our racism, abandoning the mandate of emancipation. Attempts at continued racial progress were left to the wayside. In their place came Booker T. Washington, whose doctrine of work for African Americans became gospel for a white North and South that didn't care about them, and enshrined him as the one Black man worth considering. And as the nation continued into Jim Crow, the loudest Black voice gave them a defense for it. Even today, Washington's rhetoric is held up to claim the continuing legacy of racism is merely the result of laziness. It is a farce. It is a lie. And it keeps happening. Part 4. Why does this keep happening? America has, for over a century now, been content to run with the idea that racism is over, or at least no longer worthy of public consideration. The only major change over time seems to be which Black individual gets brought up to make that point. It's through that word, individual, that we can begin to piece together why this narrative is so persistent. This narrative of racism being over survives and thrives through America's hyper-individualistic worldview. From the very start of our conversation on contemporary racism in America today, we've seemingly lost. The average American has been trained to view racism in a specific, individualistic way, as direct interpersonal discrimination. This is the only type of racism that you'll typically see acknowledged by conservatives. It's politically convenient because it allows them to seem racially conscious, while at the same time being able to brush it away as something that is just the product of a few bad actors, and not a significant issue worthy of actual addressing. When a counter-protester is killed in Charlottesville, the story is that there is, generally, good people on both sides, with one bad actor. The hundreds of openly white supremacist protesters are left out of the story. When a mass shooter targets minority groups, they are considered a lone wolf, ignoring the ecosystems that help to foster and stoke their hateful ideology. When a cop commits an extrajudicial killing of an unarmed Black person, at best, it is said to be a single bad apple cop. More likely, the victim gets blamed for their own killing. But this view fails to consider the system of policing that serves to protect these killer cops, that trains them towards violent solutions, and the racially disproportionate manner in which this type of justice is inflicted. Even when larger groups are considered, their power is diminished. The Ku Klux Klan is generally recognized as bad, but the extent of their influence at their height, having an estimated 4 million members and countless more who were sympathetic towards their ideals, is often overlooked. And the most discussed Klan actions are also largely individualistic. Our image of the Klan is largely focused on lynching and cross-burnings. While these are definitely striking and undeniably horrifying, many of the Klan's other, more nationally focused actions, such as their attacks on education, their boycott campaigns, their public demonstrations, and their political campaigning, don't receive much attention. The Confederacy is reframed as fighting for a nebulous states' rights that aims to absolve the vast majority of Confederate soldiers and citizens from charges of racism. Even literal slavery is reframed as generally less severe, with a more paternalistic view of enslaver-enslaved relations. Recall Washington's assertion that the vast majority of enslaved people who were treated with anything like decency didn't hold bitterness towards their Confederate enslavers, and consider how this framing serves to assign cruelty under a literal system of slavery, largely to the realm of individual, unkind enslavers. For this view of racism as over to flourish, it is critical that the extent of racism is always diminished, and never considered in a context beyond individual or small group actors. A similar reduction occurs with those pushing for civil rights. Note how in every section, we have focused on just one person. This is because that is how the narrative is framed. We are said to be in a post-racial era, not because of any significant policy gains, but because Obama was president. Booker T. Washington is the only black person given a national platform at the Atlanta Exposition, despite his many contemporaries with, to put it lightly, differing viewpoints. The massive scale of the civil rights movement is reduced down to just the figurehead of MLK, and his wide-ranging beliefs on racial progress are reduced down to a single line. A movement focused on systemic issues of economic inequality, actually dismantling the inequality inherent to the system of segregation, rather than just nominally ending it, and more, becomes a single dream of one man for less interpersonal racism. Through this reduction, the actual scope of the systemic racism these movements seek to combat becomes reduced. It becomes easier to claim the civil rights movement was successful in ending racism in America, when all their actual goals that were never accomplished are ignored. Considering racism purely through an individual lens makes it easy to pretend racism has been defeated. Even in a society like the US, where we continue to see a massive racial wealth gap, some will instead point to the fact that many black people are individually rich. If America is so racist, how can we explain the existence of black billionaires like Jay-Z, LeBron James, and Oprah Winfrey? And while there's a whole nother video to be made about how so many of the notable ultra-rich African Americans come from fields like entertainment or professional sports, where no matter how much money they earn, they're generating even more for the, typically white, label heads, studio heads, and team owners. We don't even need to get into that, because the exceptionally rich are just that, exceptions. The economic reality for tens of millions of black Americans has remained largely stagnant. As Clay Kane writes, Jay-Z becoming a billionaire does not give the working poor a living wage. Sure, Jay-Z can be as charitable as he wants, but how does that transform the life of someone who works 6 days a week for starvation wages? Black capitalism is not liberation, and can result in deeper black oppression. And despite the difficulties in economic advancement, the theoretical possibility of advancing serves as a cudgel with which to judge African Americans who fail to achieve the same level of success. Reminiscent of Washington's condemnation of African Americans with little ambition to create a position for themselves, but who want the federal officials to create one for them. There is a tendency to, while acknowledging the impacts of racism, nonetheless see failure to achieve some American economic dream as indicative of personal failing. Because people who are already rich love the idea of meritocracy for how it exalts them as just so hardworking. It's this perception that sees welfare seekers reframed as lazy people, taking advantage of government handouts. Well, just the black welfare seekers. The white ones don't really get paid attention to. This same perspective of theoretically possible success got applied big time to Obama. A major component of the post-racial idea is that because he had achieved the highest office in the land, there was no position to which African Americans were blocked off. And this narrative of what is theoretically possible for individuals gets used over and over to justify continued racist policy. Discriminatory drug policing and sentencing are okay because individuals can just not do drugs. Voter suppression is okay because any individual can choose to jump through all the hoops put in their way. Refusing to actually desegregate schools is okay because individuals can go to whatever school they want. Who cares that American residential areas continue to be largely segregated? Individuals can simply choose to move. With the vast wealth, there's theoretically nothing stopping them from amassing. Another unfortunate aspect of this individualistic approach to viewing racism is that it allows for the words of individual black people to triumph over mountains of evidence. Like the reconciliationists hiding behind Washington's rhetoric in order to justify their white supremacist legislation, today's Republican Party hides behind its few notable black members to justify theirs. It's no coincidence that think tanks like PragerU save their most brazenly racist scripts to be read by black people, or that the conservative justice most eager to overturn civil rights legislation is Clarence Thomas, or that those willing to toe the line tend to see their grift rewarded. Thomas was appointed to the Supreme Court despite being the least qualified sitting member, according to the American Bar Association. Comparatively, the also black but not conservative Ketanji Brown Jackson had her own nomination process dominated by claims of her being unqualified for the office, despite being unanimously ruled well qualified by the ABA. In my previous video, I discussed how there's virtually no institutional support for transgender activists compared to their transphobic counterparts, who receive think tank funding, book deals, and the like. This is also true for black civil rights activists compared to black conservatives, and has been for a long time. We've already noted the sheer amount of donations and speaking invitations Washington was able to amass. And Clay Kane notes how following the Thomas nomination, black Republican Congressman John Wilkes said of people like Thomas, "They merely say they're conservative, say they're opposed to affirmative action, and are immediately picked up by a right-wing sponsor, such as the Hoover Institution, Heritage Foundation, and American Enterprise Institute, groups not known for their sensitivity to black issues." Since we mentioned PragerU speakers earlier, there's always the famous example of Candace Owens, who failed at creating a liberal-leaning blog, then became a black conservative and saw her career explode. And of course, while it's imperative that black conservatives pretend racism doesn't exist for fear of being ousted from their own party, there's significant pressure across the aisle to downplay issues of race. Recall how much Obama felt he had to not touch on race issues in order to get anything done in his presidency. It is through the perception of Obama's presidency that we notice another troubling aspect of this phenomenon of solving racism. Because we are told racism is finite and over, any modern attempts at resolving the continuing racial inequality in America get framed as attempts to give non-whites an unfair advantage. Of course, this isn't exactly new. There's been fear-mongering since Reconstruction that African Americans have been trying to gain an unfair advantage over white Americans. But it does seem that as we get further and further from certain events, it becomes more difficult to argue on behalf of legislative solutions. It may still be that America has largely retained the same racial wealth stratification it has had since emancipation. But as we become increasingly removed from the era of slavery, at least slavery that people are willing to acknowledge, it becomes more and more difficult to make the case for, say, reparations. It doesn't matter the demonstrable good it would do when so much of the country looks at it with the mindset of, well, I never owned slaves, and you were never a slave. So, how is this a problem? American schools are still super segregated, but we've axed essentially all attempts to actually desegregate them under the logic that they've been nominally integrated for so long. Time after time, we are faced with the resounding refusal to take any action beyond the bare minimum. It doesn't matter that actual systemic wealth gain in the US has never occurred independent of public policy. Black Americans are simply expected to work harder and not expect the handouts that white Americans have been historically privy to. And if the racial wealth gap persists, it must simply be that Black people are lazy or genetically inferior. Because in a supposedly racism-solved, colorblind society that's nonetheless home to vast inequality, one is left to conclude that no, racism isn't solved, or otherwise come away with some very questionable, I post a lot on Twitter about IQ type assumptions about Black people. And of course, throughout all these assertions that racism is over, no attention gets paid to the active erosion of civil rights gains. There is the perception among Democrats that any policy aiming to specifically address matters of racial inequality will be attacked as racial grievance politics, or playing the race card. This idea does kind of fail to consider that literally anything Democrats do will be attacked as giving an unfair advantage to minorities, regardless of whether or not that's the stated intent. Just look at affirmative action and Obamacare. But because of this concern, you tend to see a preemptive shying away from racial politics, even when attempting to address matters of racial inequality, what Ta-Nehisi Coates refers to as a raceless anti-racism. And beyond Coates' observation that this results in legislation that's comparatively less effective than ones willing to actually address racism, this also serves to create an environment where the only people really discussing racism on the national stage, the people that are cementing what racism is in the public consciousness, are those fighting anti-racist legislation. The anti-racists. Man, I wish there was a shorter term for them. Compared to their liberal counterparts, the right is far more willing to make racial appeals as part of their political identity. White conservatives hide behind their Black counterparts in order to frame their positions as not racist, much how Washington's white supporters did the same. White conservatives nominate and appoint Black conservatives to positions of power in order to seem less racist, such as with Clarence Thomas, or, as noted by Clay Kane, the 2023 nomination of sophomore House Rep Byron Donalds, who gave his life to Christ in a Cracker Barrel parking lot, to the position of Speaker, with Chip Roy, the nominator, making sure to mention Donald's race in the nomination, because colorblindness is only a standard to which one side is held. And of course, there is the widespread adoption of blatant white identity politics in the Trump administration. If we wish to challenge this notion that racism is no longer significant, We need to fundamentally change the way America talks about racism. The reason that right-wing freaks organized so passionately against critical race theory is not just because conservatism thrives on blind hatred of things they're too lazy to understand. Okay, well, it's kinda that, but more significant is what critical race theory represents. A framework for analyzing systemic racism in America today. A direct challenge to both the individualistic understanding of racism and the false assertion that it's no longer an issue. A common defense from the CRT panic was that this is something that's only taught in colleges, not to kids. And that's kind of a problem. Like, cool, we have critical race theory. But what good is it if the only people encountering the concepts are the few people that take college courses on sociology, African American history, or law where it comes up? The right has been attacking public education in this country for decades, and nothing gets attacked harder than history education. They're afraid of kids being given an honest education on the history and present of systemic racism in this country because they recognize that kids are more open to actually learning. This post-racial attitude is a movement that thrives on willful ignorance. It's why McWhorter dismisses systemic racism out of hand. It's why Kirk pretends not to know what it means. There's no actual defense for this post-racial posturing. The future of the movement is reliant on kids growing up to be just as willfully ignorant as they are. Two of the authors I've cited extensively in this video, Clay Cane and Ta-Nehisi Coates, have said that their own activism was spurred in part by history education, by taking the insufficient narrative they had been given and choosing to learn the full story. My own experience has been similar. We owe it to ourselves, to our children, and to our country to improve education, to have a conversation on racism that goes beyond the stock photo image of white children laughing at black children, and actually delves into racism as a system of white supremacist control. On the legislative side, it would help to have a political party that's actually willing to discuss racism. I understand the temporary electoral appeal offered by this raceless anti-racism, but in the end, it just cedes the conversation to the right. As Haney Lopez notes, if liberals don't fight to define what racism means, the right will only too gladly define it for the whole society. Like with most issues concerning the Democratic Party, it would be really convenient if they could get some consistent messaging that doesn't suck. It was really disappointing in 2020 seeing the right had no issue banding together to declare peaceful protesters violent thugs who deserved to be shot. Meanwhile, Democrats couldn't come to a consensus on whether the appropriate course of action was to do literally anything to combat police brutality, or to massively increase police budgets. Gotta love those law and order politics. It's only through pointedly and aggressively reframing our national consensus on racism that we stand any chance of defeating these harmful post-racial narratives. The right understands this, and that's why they've been pumping so much money into the think tanks of today and the Ku Klux Klan, John Birch Society, and United Daughters of the Confederacy of yesterday. Because in the absence of good ideas, well-organized, well-funded bad ideas can rule the fucking world, baby. And if, at any point in the future, civil rights gains are made again, which seems an increasingly dodgy prospect under the present administration, we cannot grow content. We cannot grow complacent. We cannot pretend that this is the time racism has finally been solved in America. As Angela Davis notes in her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, freedom is a constant struggle. Just to be clear, the we I'm referring to is not the actual activists, who have been fighting constantly for centuries. Rather, it's mainstream, largely white America that, while wanting equality in theory, also wants to be able to not have to think about it. it becomes very easy for us to accept that a victory is secure, that we have been successful in eradicating this horrendous atrocity of our past because we've gone out and put it in the laws that it's illegal. But every historical victory has had and continues to have its opponents. Nothing is set in stone. The protections of the Civil and Voting Rights Acts have been largely stripped, not by happenstance, but because since it was written, there have been people trying to overturn it. Much of the supposed equality enjoyed by Black America is protected less in the written laws than in public opinion, which is dangerously susceptible to backsliding. If we are ever to achieve a society like the one we seem so desperate to claim we're already living in, it is not going to come about by rewriting the history books, by pretending racism in the US is a solved problem. We've been doing that for over 100 years now, and it's obvious it doesn't work. We're not going to fix racism overnight with the passage of a law or two. We can't risk falling into such limited thinking. If we the people want we the people to actually mean anything, we need to defeat this tired old lie. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video with your friends and enemies. And if you want to give me money to buy more books, to make more videos, you can donate to my Patreon, where you can watch an exclusive video and get your name in the credits, like my $10 patrons, Amy Gleixner, Arlen, Roxy, Jessica Starling, and Adam Brink. If you'd believe it, this was originally going to be a Black History Month video, but the scope of the project just kept increasing, and I had school, so that's why my second video of the year is out in September. Hope y'all are happy with the end result though, I know I am. Check out the books I mentioned in the video if you want to know more. They're all good, except the Booker T, which you should still read. I'm also always taking reading recommendations, so feel free to drop them in the comments. New Deltarune is good. See y'all in October.